In the blazing summer of 323 BCE, the greatest conqueror the world had ever known lay dying in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon. His voice was weak. His once bright eyes stared at his generals, now desperate and afraid. The man who had never lost a battle, who had marched his armies from the mountains of Greece to the rivers of India, was now powerless against a fever that no sword could slay. His name was Alexander, king of Macedon, pharaoh of Egypt, lord of Asia, and self-proclaimed son of Zeus. He was 32 years old, and in just a few days he would be dead. For more than a decade, Alexander had seemed unstoppable. From the moment he crossed into Asia in 334 BCE, he had defied the odds again and again. He had crushed the mighty Persian Empire, toppled kings, and founded cities that bore his name from Egypt to Afghanistan. His soldiers called him invincible. His enemies called him divine. But behind the myth of the God King was a man, brilliant, ruthless, and driven by an ambition that burned brighter than any empire could contain. And as his power grew, so too did the cracks beneath his throne. Alexander's final campaign had taken him farther east than any Greek army had ever gone. After defeating Darius III of Persia, he had marched into Central Asia, conquered Bactria, and crossed the Hindu Kush to challenge the Indian kingdoms beyond. There, in 326 BCE, he faced King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes. It was a brutal and costly victory. Alexander's men fought through torrential rain, elephants, and exhaustion. They won, but they had reached their limit. When Alexander demanded to march even farther east, toward the mysterious lands of the Ganges, his men refused. They had been away from home for 8 long years. They wanted to go back. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, Alexander gave in. His army turned west, but something had changed. The God King, who once inspired absolute loyalty, now ruled over weary men. The dream of endless conquest was broken. As the army trudged back across deserts and mountains, thousands died from hunger, thirst, and heat. By the time they reached Babylon, Alexander was no longer the same man. Babylon was to be his capital, the heart of a new empire that stretched across 3 continents. There, Alexander began to plan his next great campaign on an invasion of Arabia. He envisioned fleets sailing from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea, conquering new lands and securing his control over trade routes. But before he could set his plans in motion, fate intervened. In late May of 323 BCE, Alexander attended a banquet hosted by one of his admirals. The wine flowed freely, the music played, and the conqueror drank deeply per night as he always did. Sometime during or after the feast, he developed a fever. At first, no one was alarmed. Soldiers in Mesopotamia often fell ill from malaria or typhoid, but Alexander's condition worsened quickly. Within days, he could barely speak or move. He was carried to his bed, drenched in sweat, his body racked with pain. The fever raged for nearly 2 weeks. Day after day, his generals stood by helplessly as their king's strength faded. Some claimed he was poisoned, others that the gods themselves had struck him down for daring to call himself divine. Whatever the cause, Alexander's mind remained sharp to the end. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, he reportedly summoned his commanders and handed his royal signet ring to Perdiccas, one of his most trusted officers. When asked to whom he left his vast empire, Alexander's answer was said to be just 3 words: to the strongest. Whether he actually said those words, no one can be sure. Ancient historians like Arrian, Plutarch, and Diodorus all tell slightly different versions of his final moments. But what is certain is that on June 10, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great, the man who had united Greece and destroyed Persia, died in his bed in Babylon. And with his death, the world he built began to collapse. When word spread through the camp that the king was dead, disbelief turned to panic. Many soldiers refused to accept it. They demanded to see his body. According to legend, Alexander's corpse showed no sign of decay for several days, as if even death hesitated to claim him. To his followers, it was proof that he truly was divine. But to his generals, it was the beginning of chaos. Alexander had left no clear heir. His wife, Roxana of Bactria, was pregnant, but her child had not yet been born. He had a half-brother, Aridaeus, but the man was mentally unfit to rule. The empire needed leadership and fast. In the days following Alexander's death, his generals, known as the Diadochi, gathered to decide who would inherit his throne. What followed was one of the most ruthless power struggles in history. Perdiccas, who held the royal seal, tried to maintain unity. He proposed that they wait for Roxana's child to be born and rule in the meantime as regent. But others, like Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antipater, had their own ambitions. The dream of a single empire under one ruler quickly fell apart. Within months, Alexander's generals began carving up his territories like scavengers dividing a carcass. Egypt went to Ptolemy, who soon declared himself pharaoh, and founded a dynasty that would last nearly 300 years. Seleucus took control of Babylon and much of Asia, creating what would become the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus took the western provinces in Anatolia, while Cassander fought for control of Greece and Macedonia. The empire Alexander had forged through blood and brilliance disintegrated almost overnight. His vision of a united world, where Greek and Persian cultures merged into one, was lost to greed and ambition. The wars of the Diadochi raged for decades, turning friends into enemies and allies into assassins. Roxana and her son, the young Alexander IV, were murdered before the boy could claim his father's throne. The dream of Alexander's dynasty died with them, but as his empire shattered, his legend only grew stronger. Even in death, Alexander was larger than life. Cities he founded, from Alexandria in Egypt to Kandahar in Afghanistan, became centers of trade, learning, and power. Greek language and culture spread across the East, blending with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions. This fusion, the Hellenistic world, became one of the most influential eras in human history. Philosophy, art, and science flourished in cities that bore his name. The Library of Alexandria became a beacon of knowledge. Greek architecture and ideas would shape the civilizations that followed, from Rome to Byzantium. In a sense, Alexander's empire never truly died. It simply transformed. Yet the mystery of his death has never been fully solved. Was he poisoned, as many of his generals believed? Or was it disease brought on by exhaustion, wounds, and years of hard campaigning? Ancient sources mention several possibilities: a fever from the swamps around Babylon, malaria, typhoid, even complications from old battle injuries. Some modern scholars suggest he may have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that could explain his paralysis and slow death. Others think he might not have died when people thought he did. One chilling theory suggests that Alexander was not truly dead when his body was sealed in its coffin. Because his body showed no decay for days, some historians believe he may have fallen into a deep coma, his breathing and heartbeat so faint they went unnoticed. If true, then the god king who could not be killed in battle might have died buried alive. Whatever the cause, his death marked a turning point in history. The world before Alexander had been one of divided kingdoms: Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, Indians, each with their own borders and rivalries. The world after him was globalized in a way humanity had never seen. Trade routes stretched across continents. Ideas crossed cultures. For centuries after, rulers from Julius Caesar to Napoleon would look to Alexander as the model of ultimate conquest. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of all was the curse of his ambition. Alexander had achieved everything, and yet for him it was never enough. He once wept, according to legend, because there were no more worlds left to conquer. He had dreamed of reaching the edge of the earth, of uniting all mankind under his rule. But in the end, his empire could not outlive the man who built it. As his generals tore each other apart, the people of his empire were left to wonder, what would have happened if Alexander had lived? Would he have conquered Arabia, perhaps even Rome? Would the world have become one vast empire under Greek rule? Or was his death inevitable, the price of reaching too far, too fast? His body was eventually taken from Babylon, likely by Ptolemy, who intercepted the funeral procession and brought it to Egypt. There, in Alexandria, Alexander was entombed in a magnificent sarcophagus of gold and glass. For centuries, emperors and conquerors visited his tomb to pay homage: Julius Caesar, Augustus, Caligula. But over time, the tomb vanished from history. Its exact location remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of archaeology. Somewhere beneath the sands of Alexandria, the remains of the god king may still lie waiting. More than 2,000 years after his death, Alexander's story continues to fascinate and inspire. He was a conqueror, but also a visionary, a warrior, but also a dreamer. He sought not only to rule the world, but to transform it, to blend East and West into a single civilization. His death ended that dream, but his influence endured. The cities he founded became bridges between cultures. The generals who betrayed him spread his legacy through war. The philosophers and artists who came after him built on his foundations. In the end, Alexander's true conquest was not of land or power, but of time itself. From a small kingdom in northern Greece, a young man rose to challenge the greatest empire on earth, and won. He led his army farther than any had gone before, and in doing so he changed the course of human history. But even the greatest of men are mortal. As his generals stood around his deathbed in Babylon, watching the life fade from their god-king's eyes, they must have realized the terrible truth, that all empires, no matter how vast, begin and end with a single heartbeat. Alexander's empire did not survive him, but his name, his legend, would echo across millennia. In every language, on every continent, his story endures, and perhaps that was his greatest victory.